Tiffany here of Tiffany Gordon Cosplay with a cosplay tutorial. This time it is for the large dual blade of the Blizzarioth set from Monster Hunter Rise. And if you'd like to make your own, I have a blueprint to help you. It is available on my website, www.tiffanygordoncosplay.com, or see the link below. And to first start off, we are going to discuss how I made the bone structure for the dual blade, as well as how I made it disassemble so I can travel with it. And I used CPVC pipe in sizes 1/2 in the blade part, and then for the handle part, I used 1 inch. And for this dual blade, I'm gonna have it separate from the handle with the circle part from the blade part, and that's where they're both gonna come together. So after I figured out those two pieces, I then measured them and then went to my workbench and cut the pieces to length with a jeweler's saw. And we'll be using for that a male and female CPVC slip stainless steel adapters. And for attaching these pieces to the CPVC pipe, you're going to want to use 120 grit sandpaper to rough up the surface of your CPVC pipe, and then you will use 2-part epoxy to attach either the male and the female ends to both parts. And you'll need to wait 24 hours for it to fully dry before working with it again. And onto the blade portion of the dual blade. And for this, we're going to be using insulation foam. Taking the blade part of the blueprint and laying it on top, and then tracing it with a Sharpie 3 times. A reminder, safety first when working with this material, as it can cause really bad skin irritation, so you will want to wear gloves, as well as if you are going to be cutting or sanding any of this, wearing proper safety gear such as a respirator or a dust mask. And then for cutting the shape out, I use what is called a hot wire, which is a device that will have heat through a very small wire piece, and it will burn the insulation foam in that spot. Really nice and precise lines. Next, you're going to want to grab your inner bone structure piece, and then you will want to lay your blade and this piece onto your blueprint and figure out the alignment of where you want it to sit, and trace out the section of the bone structure onto the middle section of your insulation foam. And once you have that part traced, you can then cut it out using a box cutter. Then you're going to want to insert your bone structure into the hollow spot, and then using hot glue, cover the outer edge all the way and then over the CPVC pipe to ensure that it will hold in place. Once that side is dry, flip it over and do it to the other side. And this middle piece is going to be sandwiched in between the other 2 cut out insulation foam pieces. So this is what it should look like so far. For gluing the pieces together, again, I use hot glue. This time you want to work extremely fast and then put it on top and hold it in place until it cools. You won't have a permanent bond with this, but that's okay because we're going to cover it in a bit with Worbla. After all 3 of the insulation foam pieces are fully attached to the middle section, I highly recommend checking out your threaded system to make sure you haven't glued anything incorrectly, but it should easily just unscrew into the 2 pieces. Now to start adding details to this piece. And again, I used the blueprint and traced out where all of the little teeth-like sections were going to go. And then proceeded to carve out my shape using a hot wire as well as a box cutter here and there. And because we're going to be wrapping this in Worbla, we want to make sure the surface is as smooth as possible, where if we were doing this with EVA foam, it wouldn't matter as much. So to do this, I went to my workbench and used a 2-inch sanding drum and sanded out everything as much as possible. And the very last detail part before covering was to go back with a hot wand this time and add details going down the length of the blade. Now for Worbla. And for this, we're going to be using the Worbla Black Art, which is for more detail pieces in the Worbla family. And to start off, you're going to want to put your dual blade on top of the Worbla and then cut out 2 separate pieces that should be able to cover 1/2 of the blade. We're going to be doing the sandwich method for covering this piece. Next, we're going to use a heat gun and we're going to heat up all of the Worbla so it starts to get a little loose. At that moment, you will want to cover it on top of 1/2 of the dual blade, draping it over and trying to smooth out here and there. You will have to play back and forth with the heat because once it starts to cool, it will start to harden. So you will need to go back and forth with your heat gun onto the Worbla and slowly push it into all of the crevices of your blade section. Side note, direct heat applied to insulation foam will cause it to melt. So make sure to only apply your heat gun heat to the Worbla part of your piece. You can also use any type of tools such as sculpting tools, clay tools, or you can even use flat spoons and things to work in and push the Worbla into tight crevices. And once 1/2 of it is covered, I then go back with scissors, cut off all of the extra scrap. You will want to leave a little bit of an edge so that way the other side will have something to attach to. Also, your Worbla will cut easier if it is slightly hot. And then repeat the same processes for the other side. You will also want to heat up a little bit of the already covered part of the Worbla, as this gives you the best bond together when attaching two pieces of Worbla together. And then just layer it over and work the Worbla into all the crevices again, and then slowly start to remove the edges and fuse and pinch them together so that way they have a proper bond. Once you're happy with how it is, you can go back with a heat gun and then some flat clay working tools and slowly smooth out your edge so you no longer have a crack. And all of the little detail pieces we added into the insulation foam before the Worbla, it will all start to show once you apply the heat with the heat gun. You can just slightly tap your finger on top and then push it into all the cracks. You can also use a pencil or a pin or a sharp point to work the Worbla into those crevices as well, and it will really make all the details come to life. Now to start working with EVA foam for details. And to start off, we're going to be using 4mm EVA foam to do the detail part on the spine of the blade, taking it to the workbench using a sanding drum on all of the edges, and then attaching it to the top part of the Worbla using contact cement glue. And this is the process where you apply it to both surfaces, let it fully dry, and then attach both parts together to give you the best bond. And to give it a really nice, grimy Monster Hunter texture, I went back with a hot wand and did little kind of dots going downward, which kind of looked a little bit like bark. The next part we're going to talk about is how I did the balls on the handle. And for this, I used Costtool's circle cutter, cutting a bunch of circles so that way this would make it a lot easier to glue them together and then slowly carve them with a box cutter to a rounded shape. And to smooth off all the edges, I went back to my workbench and using a 2-inch sanding drum, sanded everything flat. And then proceeded to glue detail pieces together onto all of these parts. And for the strap on the handle, for this part, I covered the exposed CPVC pipe fully with contact cement glue, and then cut out some small strips of 2mm EVA foam and glued it into the crisscross shape onto the handle. And then did the same type of process for some more detail pieces on the blade section. For the shell-like part on the handle, I cut this part out of 10mm EVA foam, sanded the spine of the piece at a slight 45, and glued the two halves together with contact cement glue. And for all of the top part of the spine that had some spike-like pieces, I cut these out of 4mm EVA foam into triangle sections, glued them together, and then attached them on top so this would slowly give us our three-dimensional shape. And this piece has tons of spikes coming out of it, and for this I did a mixture of some pieces out of 4mm EVA foam, cutting them and then splitting out the center pieces at a 45 so that way I could bend it into shape, gluing them together in the shape that I wanted, and then cutting them and sanding them to a rounder shape. And then for the smaller spikes that are on the body part of the shell, I ended up 3D printing some small spikes and then with an X-Acto knife cut out a negative spot for them to sit into, attaching them with contact cement glue. And for all of the detail carved out parts onto the body of the shell, I ended up drawing on the pattern with a Sharpie and then used a hot wand to burn out the markings that I wanted. Now that that part's done, it is time to attach it to the handle, and again I did this with contact cement glue, making sure to only attach it to the handle part and not to the blade, so that way our piece can still disassemble into two sections. I will also note that because this is a threaded system, you will want to make sure the handle part is fully tightened into the blade section before attaching, because wherever you attach this piece onto the handle is where it is always going to align. And the very final part for this was to fill in some of the gaps around the spikes on the shell part, and for this I used foam clay. The process of applying water and then adding some foam clay to smooth it around the sections, and then I went back with a little bit of tooling to make it look more natural and less placed there. And here's what the finished base structure should look like once you're done. Now to prime the piece, and for this I'm going to be using 3 heavy coats of Plasti Dip onto all of the surface. This includes the Worbla part of the surface. Also, you will want to mask off all of your threaded sections, the male and the female part, so that way the Plasti Dip does not cover it. Now for painting, and for this we're going to be using my Iwata Eclipse airbrush gun, as well as Createx Colors Wicked Color airbrush paint for the whole project. Starting with the side lightning bolt part, painting it with a base coat of crimson red, painting it with a mixture of black and crimson red to give it a really deep color. And then for shadowing, I went back over the entire surface with just black and then wiped away with a paper towel while it was still wet, so that way all of the higher surfaces would bring forth the red and the lower surfaces would still hold the black. And to give it just a tiny bit more zing to the surface, I went with a dry paintbrush and bright red and just lightly went over the higher sections to give a tiny bit more of an organic look. Once that was done and dry, I then masked it off with some masking tape, and then it's time to do the blade body part. And for this, I started off with Hansa Yellow, applying it to the entire surface of the blade, and then went back with orange. After, I started at the tip part with a orange crimson red mixture, doing a light gradient from that to orange in the center, to the base a more light yellow orange mix. Now to grimify it, and for this again I would work it in small sections, spraying the black paint and wiping it away with a paper towel while still wet, ensuring all of the black to stay in the crevices and make it really look grimy. And once again, with the dry paintbrush, I did a little bit of texturing part onto the highlighted higher sections, doing yellow at the bottom, a little bit of orange in the center, and just straight up red at the top. And this really just made it feel more organic and less airbrush painted. And when all of that was done and dry, I masked it off with some masking tape and some paper, and then did a base coat over the only part that's exposed now using black paint, let that dry, and then sprayed Quicksilver on top of that. And then one more time with the black paint and wiping it away so it would stay in all of the crevices and give you nice shadows. Now to talk about painting the bottom handle part of the dual blade. And for this, I did a base coat of cream onto the shell section of the part. And for this part, I wanted it to really feel very light and more like a seashell. So I went with a very light brown mixture that was heavily watered down and a dry paintbrush, and kind of fluffed it around the edges of the part so it looked very organic. Having it darker towards the bottom and feathering it lightly as it went towards the spine of the shell. I then went in by paintbrush. Again, all this is airbrush paint, and painted around the bottom sections so they were really stand out as darker there. And for all the spike parts, I did a really dark brown-black mixture, just applying it flat for now, and then adding black to the points of the spikes. For all of the carved out sections that were lines throughout the piece, I went back in with some cream color airbrush paint, applying it by paintbrush into all of these pieces, and it really just started making it come to life. And that finishes off the shell. So once that was fully dry, I then masked it off again with masking tape and paper, and then back to the airbrush booth, where I then did a base coat of black onto the rest of our surfaces, and then followed up with Quicksilver on top, and once again after that, some black for the shadowing, wiping away all of our higher surfaces. I then removed all of the masked off parts and then went back again with some more detail painting by hand, adding a little bit of highlight with some Quicksilver and dry brush here and there, as well as painting the strap section on the handle using a cream color and paintbrush. And the very last step to complete our dual blade is to seal it. And for this, we're going to be using Cratex Colors UVLS, and we're going to be using their satin onto all of the metal shiny parts that we painted. And then we will be using their matte onto the shell part and the blade part of the dual blade. And once that's all dry, you can screw your two pieces together to create one magnificent dual blade. And that, guys, is how I made the larger Blizzarioth dual blade for my Monster Hunter Rise cosplay. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if so, let me know in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you for our next cosplay build. Much love, guys. Bye-bye.